So I'll introduce our two speakers today just very quickly, and then we'll move right into our talk. So Maria Turek has just completing her research fellowship with the Robert H.N. Family Foundation Program in Buddhist Studies. She was a 2020 research fellow. And Maria received her PhD in Asian Studies from the Humboldt University of Berlin in 2013. She's been working on a project that we'll hear about today on reimagining the Buddhist Kingdom of Nangchen in Tibet. And so I'll let her tell us more about that as we get going. And Maria also teaches courses on Buddhism at the University of Toronto Scarborough campus. And following Maria's talk, we're very grateful to have Professor Songsarima Ujid with us from the University of Michigan. Songsarima is a researcher who focuses on transnational, transregional, and cross-cultural aspects of Tibetan Buddhism during the early modern period. She's especially interested in issues of lineage, reincarnation, identity formation, knowledge transmission, and travel. Songsarima is mainly a textual scholar who's really invested in ongoing discourses in decolonialism, transnationalism, translation theory, narratology, oral literature, and literary theory. And her research materials span Tibetan Buddhist literature and Qing period archival materials that are written in Tibetan, Mongolian, Manchu, and Chinese. So with that, I'd like to invite Maria to tell us about her research.
So thank you very much, Francis and Sarah, and to York Uni for co-organizing this event, and for Songsarima for agreeing to discuss this material with me. I'm very excited. This has been a project I've worked on for a long time, and I will tell you a little bit about how it began. But first, maybe just very general what this paper will be about today. The Tibetan Kingdom of Nangchen was located in what is today the Yushu Tibetan Autonomous Prefecture, China's Qinghai province. Famous among other polities of Eastern Tibet, or Kham, as they are known, for the vibrant contemplative and ritual traditions, a long lineage of Dharma kings, and a distinct collective identity, Nangchen is a major site for the study of Buddhist societies. In spite of this prominence, the kingdom remains largely uncharted by Western academia. Multiple colonial histories obscured the local narrative. Colonial epistemologies are still reproduced by Western scholars today from the primary sources they study. This paper is a part of a larger project, which Professor Garrett has mentioned, which aims at decolonizing the local narrative. The project is entitled Reimagining the Buddhist Kingdom of Nangchen, and it is possible entirely thanks to the generosity of the Robert H.N. Family Foundation. My training is in Asian studies, particularly in the study of Tibet. So this work has been informed by newly emerged local historiographic works in Tibetan and ethnographic observations in Yushu and among Tibetan exiles. This presentation will outline some of the complexities, entanglements, and disappointments also of decolonizing the emic voice. And I believe that an area studies approach can facilitate this work. But why should Nangchen be interesting, and not just to Tibet scholars? I mentioned the rich religious culture and society that is little known outside of ethnic Tibet and its diasporic extensions, but I believe that even beyond the Tibetan Himalayan context, the focus on a hitherto peripherized people can inform our knowledge of Buddhist collective identities, both in the past and today. Revisiting broader Asian history from the perspective of local borderland experience may also add to our understanding of significant historical processes from the 20th century. I will give you one example. What I would like to present today would be, first of all, some of the local narrative itself. How do people from Yushu Prefecture and exiled locals remember the Buddhist kingdom, its social structures, and how do they retell their history? I will also emphasize the social authority of the native historian. Then I would like to briefly show how this local narrative has in the meantime gone global, following the globalization of Tibetan Buddhism. Finally, I will discuss the work of decolonizing. I will ask about the functionality and limitation of the concept of indigeneity. I will propose that studying Nangchen's social organization may complicate our understanding of subalternity. Particularly, I will inquire into the role of historical elites in the consistent proliferation of indigenous local identity in the presence of the consecutive colonial projects, including the current domination by the Chinese state. My first example will show how the native practices of historiography, rooted in monastic orthodoxy, are linked to the local social hierarchy. I will also discuss a ritual of placemaking to illustrate how Nangchen elites exercised stewardship over ancestral and spiritual relations to the native land. But first, how did this project come about, you may ask? So in 2007 and 8, when I was collecting material for my dissertation about the recent revival of tantric Buddhist hermitages and meditation practice within China, I noticed that many of the most striking examples of contemporary Tibetan asceticism were concentrated in Yushu Prefecture, the location of the historical Buddhist Kingdom of Nangchen. And this will be coming out as a book, but back to those first years of fieldwork, I noticed right in the beginning just how strongly, explicitly and implicitly, this local instance of Buddhist revival, the actors were relying on local tradition and history. Since that first research period, I have been collecting newly published historiographies of Nangchen, some of them published by large state-owned presses, such as the Gansum Mirik Pedrenkang, but also those printed in local monasteries, in private collections, printed in the diaspora, some of them circulating in manuscript form. Most of these books represent monastic history through genres such as Logyu, Chujung, or Jarap, but I also collect hagiographies and ritual texts. They are also very informative. The contemporary authors of these texts, many of them of whom are still alive, practice traditional Tibetan ways of history writing and base their work on diverse local archival materials and on well-known historical works from the Tibetan Himalayan world. For instance, Lorong Chojung. Most of these native historians received a great deal of monastic training, some of them in pre-1950s Nangchen, and I will introduce a few of these scholars later in my talk. As for my other sources for this project, I have been very, very lucky because 3 years ago, I relocated to Toronto, Canada, which has the second largest Tibetan community in North America. Many Tibetans are from Nangchen, and I have been very fortunate to be able to meet, work with, and befriend a number of important revivalists of the Nangchen local identity. This is a photo from the last Losar celebration just before the pandemic, and it's a celebration by the Canada chapter of the Nangchen Association. And you can notice the king, the picture of the last Nangchen king right underneath the Dalai Lama. I don't know if I have a pointer here. I probably cannot point. Yeah, but if you can look, you may be able to see. So this project has been emerging slowly for many years, but it was stalling, and it was only in 2020 due to the generosity of the whole foundation that I could really begin with this work. So where was Nangchen? Nangchen belonged to the large portion of the Tibetan plateau consisting of various polities referred to collectively as Kham, or Eastern Tibet, and not Amdo as some think. These regions have traditionally been perceived by both China and Tibet as a periphery of their respective variously defined territories. Today, Kham is part of the remote and rural ethnic Tibetan regions of China, and it's split into several provinces. Locating the historical kingdom will pose the kind of difficulties that arise when describing all decentralized polities, additionally positioned at the crossroads of larger powers. So Nangchen's contemporary location roughly corresponds with that of Yushu Tibetan Autonomous Prefecture in Qinghai, and not, as some people think, only with the Nangchen County in Yushu. Yeah? It was much larger. It was as large as Yushu Prefecture. The kingdom extended on the vast plains and mountainous areas centering on the Zachu or Mekong Basin, but also stretching beyond the Drichu, the Yangtze River. From the south, and other important rivers of the region are the Machu and the Chichu. From the south, 20th century Nangchen bordered on the central Tibetan state, notably on its Chamdo and Rinpoche principalities, and on Gyade. This is a nomadic area. From the east on the kingdoms of Dege and Tlatok, and from the northeast on Golok. When I mentioned in Dege, I have to say that Nangchen was way more pastoral than Dege, that had a lot of pronounced agricultural communities. The northern and southwestern frontiers of Nangchen were less apparent due to the fact that the adjacent wastelands of Jiangtang and Yarmutang were practically depopulated. So what can we learn about Nangchen's past from local historiographies? I will just describe here some highlights which outline the past and which have at the same time been important for placemaking, identity formation, and territorial discourses of the Nangchen people. Here you can see a native map in the earliest of the modern histories, drawn on the basis of a land edict. This is a clumsy translation of the term Sayik, because it doesn't have the same legal kind of significance in Nangchen. But anyway, it's the best translation I can come up with. So it was composed by one of the Nangchen kings. The book itself, where this map is reproduced, is a manuscript written in India in 1965 by Kamartine Rinpoche, one of the most authoritative voices of Nangchen history and an important historical witness. I will introduce him later along with other native scholars. The earliest power center in the kingdom was at the same time the first noted Buddhist monastery. It was the Barum Kagyu monastery of Kumbum, founded by the Tangut master Ripa Karpo in the 13th century. Ripa Karpo was a disciple of the first Tibetan imperial preceptor at the Tangut court, Tishi Ripa Shirav, famous as a master of meditation and miracles. Tishi Ripa died in Nangchen, and the Kumbum monastery that was founded on the spot became the scene of an important encounter with the Mongols. In 1240, Genghis Khan's grandson, Godam Khan, dispatched the famous reconnaissance expedition to Tibet. The soldiers, the garrison made a stop, made a halt at Nangchen, and Ripa Karpo was established as the main religious authority, along with a man called Dru Driwa Au. He was a layman who was charged with overseeing secular matters. He's an important person because a generation later, his son would become the first Nangchen Gyalpo, the king. And actually, some of the local sources already title Driwa Au as the king. The Satya master Chogyal Pakpa, whose success at the court of Kublai Khan and his resulting supremacy over central and western Tibet are well documented, also made a halt in Nangchen in 1274, while on the way from the Mongol court in Liangzhou to Sakya in central Tibet. Pakpa sanctioned a member of another prominent clan, the Tsangsar, to exert both religious and temporal rule over upper central Nangchen. The Mongols introduced an administrative structure. Kumbum Monastery developed into a local power center with the authority to rule over 12 myriarchies. In this period, that Nangchen was organized into 25 secular divisions and 18 monastic districts. These are designations still used today. And also, hence this designation, Nangchen Nyanga, or the Nangchen 25, that you may have seen. I'm just going to go back to the slide, which you can see here as the logo and name of this diasporic organization today. Nangchen grew to become a Kagyu stronghold, and the Barum tradition became the principal religious and political force in the kingdom in the initial stages of its existence. The Barum Kagyu later declined and was revived by the Rime movement in the 19th century, the non-sectarian movement. Today, it flourishes again around the monastic center of Chodrak. On the inside, Nangchen was afflicted by feuds, which in the early 14th century led to a succession struggle between the religio-political contestants, and consequently the power over at least the upper sections of the Zachu Basin was split between two competing clans, the mentioned Tsangsar and the Dru. The Dru clan appealed for support to the Sakya Mongol regime, to Sakya. As a result of this intervention in 1300, the Zhu son, Chökyi Gyaltsen, was enthroned as the Chogyal, or Gyalpo, the king, the Dharma Raja. The Dharma Raja refers to the pan-Tibetan and Indic ideal of a sovereign who rules in accordance with Buddhist teachings. In the contemporary histories, the Dru are portrayed as a bloodline endowed with divine origin. So it's kind of stylized after the Central Tibetan emperors. And the dynasty of kings, also seen as embodiments of Avalokiteshvara and portrayed as a lineage of dedicated meditators, remained in the center of most religious affairs and of the local power grid until 1951, when Nangchen was incorporated into New China. Now, a key element of the self-image of the kingdom, still reiterated today in many different ways, refers to the time of its inception, of the kingdom's inception, and to the legends of the first rulers who are known like Tishirepa as masters of meditation and miracles. I will quote here on the widespread self-designation, Nangchen Gongde, Nangchen, the realm of meditators, which alludes both to local history and the popular legend about a universal access to tantric Buddhist practices and advanced contemplative methods. So this is a quote, this is going to be a quote from one of the local sources I'm reading. At the time of the Barom Dharma lords, fathers and sons, Nangchen was given the name home of cotton-clad yogins, realm of meditators. The reason for this designation was the succession of cotton-clad lamas and their disciples who upheld the examples of the Kagyu fathers and wore a single cotton garment without distinguishing summer and winter. So it's an allusion to miraculous qualities. Home, or Tsang, is the honorific designation for the assembly of lamas and their disciples. As for the name realm of meditators, Gonde, all men were meditators, all women were meditators. And in the photo here, you can see Lama Tsurtim Tachin, a cotton-clad meditation master from contemporary Nangchen. And he was the main protagonist of my dissertation, and I will have a book about him coming out. So you can see that this is being reiterated today very much. There's this legend about a ubiquitous access to advanced contemplation techniques, but also the designation, the realm of meditators, pointed out to the fact that among other polities of Kham, Nangchen became famous for the many tantric Buddhist masters and numerous monasteries and hermitages, as well as a distinct style of doing religion. Okay, back to the history. After 1642, like much of the Tibetan world, Nangchen became a protectorate of the newly formed Ganden Pudrang, the central Tibetan state governing from Lhasa. Its rulers, Gushui Khan and the fifth Dalai Lama, upheld the rights of the Nangchen Gyalpo to rule in the monastic and lay estates. In 1648, two representatives of the fifth Dalai Lama were sent to Nangchen to collect a census to enforce tribute to Lhasa. The ensuing conversion of monasteries into Gelugpa opened up possibilities for the Ganden Pudrang to encroach on Nangchen later, when it was independent from central Tibet, and I will come back to that. In 1725, in the aftermath of the rebellion against China's Qing dynasty, initiated by Gushui Khan's grandson, the Prince of Kokonor, Lobsang Danjing, Nangchen was absorbed into Qing territories under the jurisdiction of the Amban, or imperial representative, from faraway Xining on the Kokonor. But this incorporation was mostly nominal. The 18th Nangchen king, Dorje Tseong, received the hereditary title of Changhu, equivalent to Chiliarch, or chief of 1,000 men, which practically means that he could collect tribute from 1,000 families. Local officials subordinate to the king received the lesser ranks of Behu and Bechang. For the Manchus, these titles were an instrument of representing power over fringe areas, while for the Tibetans, the ranks confirmed the earlier local administration. So it just confirmed the status quo on the ground. The Xining Amban did not interfere with the on-the-ground affairs of the kingdom. The taxes and the duties to the Qing imposed in Nangchen were marginal, actually symbolic. However, scholars have written extensively about the proficiency with which the Qing controlled the narrative about the empire's borderlands, effectively leaving no doubts as to their de facto administration of the barbarian groups from the far fringe of the empire. And barbarian is, of course, a quote from those sources. I mentioned bestowing ranks, but we should also acknowledge cartographic projects by the Qing, which depicted autonomous realms like Nangchen in relation to the power center in Beijing. Since 1912, the new Chinese Republic exercised control over areas of Eastern Tibet with various means. Selected areas, I have to say. Nangchen was under the rule of a Muslim warlording family by the name of Ma. Their interest focused on Jiegundo, or Yushu in Chinese, a vibrant and cosmopolitan trade center of lucrative wool trade. Especially the last governor of what soon became Qinghai, Ma Bufang, was interested in profiting from the wool and yak hide commerce, imposing heavy tolls on the population and enforcing punitive raids on monasteries, which did not meet the fiscal demands on time. On the other side of the then existing Sino-Tibetan frontier along southwestern Nangchen, the central Tibetan state encroached on the domestic affairs in the few monasteries of the Gelugpa order located in Nangchen. Lhasa also used the politics of historical representation when in 1914 at the Simla Convention, they produced results of the census collected 150 years earlier during the central Tibetan domination of Kham as proof of their territorial claims over Nangchen and Eastern Tibet. And we know this from Shakapa's history of Tibet. This is not even the local sources. And this is how the narrative of Greater Tibet, which artificially included Kham and Amdo, was first applied to control both knowledge production on Nangchen and the political discourse around it. And that is an imperialist practice. I'm sorry to say, many scholars will hesitate to point this out in order not to disturb the contemporary plight of the Tibetans against the People's Republic. And I sympathize completely, and with all due respect, but I just have to point this out. In 1932, in the course of the colliding nation-state projects on both sides of the Sino-Tibetan border, Central Tibetan armies and Mapufang troops collided on Nangchen territory. And this is a well-known fact. It's well known from the gold sign study that we all read when we learn to become Tibetologists. But it is not widely known that this armed conflict began as a local dispute over taxes on the largest land-owning estate of Surmang, home monastery of the famous Surmang Tumba. Many locals were enlisted by Mapufang to fight against what they believe were unfair fiscal claims laid in the name of the Lhasa administration. For both sides of the struggle, controlling Jikundo had become increasingly important in terms of its strategic and commercial potential. Since the early years of the Chinese Republic, in consequence of the tensions between the Sichuan governor and the Ganin Pudrang, trading key goods such as tea from China and transporting Tibetan and Indian commodities to China could only take place via Jikundo, since the direct route through Sichuan was not in use. The colonial claims and influences were entangled with local identity making. Native historians describe how during armed conflicts, the kings and the local elite often acted in an opportunistic manner. In times of peace, the king and the powerful clans acted pragmatically in that they willingly applied insignia, titles, or other representations of authority received from various overlords from far away in order to emphasize their status in the local hierarchy. In this slide, you can see the last king, Tashi Tsewang Dorje, surrounded by his four ministers. The king is actually wearing his Changhu hat, topped with a red coral, that one of his predecessors had received from Yongjang Emperor via the Yunnan governor in the 18th century. The production of Nangchen's peripherality in Manchu, Mandarin, and Tibetan historical documents has had an enduring legacy in contemporary Western scholarship. Especially the studies based on Chinese and Manchu sources conceptualize Nangchen as marginal. Focusing on the political and economic histories around the trading town of Jekundo, they circumvent the developments around the capital of Nangchen Gar, which focus the authority of the king and the socio-religious network of local power. As such networks employ a colonialist perspective inherited from their primary sources. This perspective has led many researchers to develop a convenient blindness to the underground narrative and indeed to the historical identity of the Nangchen people. Tibetologist research of Kham, or rather its deficiency, I should say, has for a long time been positioned in an uncomfortable split between two different political points. One has been the support for the current Tibetan government in exile, who disseminate the narrative of a greater Tibet that I already mentioned. And the other, not surprisingly, the post-Marxist viewpoint about the superfluous nature of ethnic identity. Accordingly, the first position has for a long time deflected our attention from the cultural, historical, religious, and linguistic diversities in Eastern Tibetan societies in favor of a monolithic narrative of a Tibetanness in which all cultural meanings and historicity flow from Lhasa, and the Dalai Lamas are the ultimate authority on all things Tibetan. And I'm saying this with all due respect to the Dalai Lama. And I'm just critiquing this position, which may also reflect the sectarian tensions between those Tibetologists who are scholar practitioners, illustrating our dependency on emic histories along with their politics we inherit from our sources, informants, and mentors. On the other hand, some post-Marxist positions in the work on Eastern Tibet have promoted the reductionist approach in which the local narrative is represented by proverbs and everyday customs. So it is perhaps no coincidence that the groundbreaking work on Khampa societies and their histories was carried out first and foremost by ethnic Tibetan scholars native to their respective regions of Dege, Minyak, Nyarong, and Jarong. And I'm thinking here, of course, of Rinzin Tardyal in his great volume, Nomads of Eastern Tibet, that he produced together with Tony Huber. I'm talking about Yudrut Somo, who's a fantastic scholar I look up to a lot, and to Jinpa Tenzin, who's also very well informed and very, very eloquent. Of course, I mean here monographs that are devoted to those polities, and of course, I'm acknowledging the collected volume, Khampa Histories, which came out by Brill. So these are the exceptions. And so are some more recent initiatives like Stefan Gross' Kham Project, in which I also had the pleasure to participate. But coming back to the native discourse in Nangchen, the monastic historians portray the kingdom as a self-referential sphere of autonomy, prestige, religious vibrancy, and a Buddhist orientation of society. The Nangchen people saw themselves as belonging to the Tibetan cultural historical sphere in which society was a vehicle for the practice and transmission of Buddhism. I mentioned the divine lineage of the Dharma Rajas and how the many individual kings were seen as exemplary tantric masters. The dynastic life force, La in Tibetan, was connected to a mountain deity in a similar manner to that of the old Tibetan emperors, which demonstrates the proliferation of indigenous pre-Buddhist beliefs in the representation of kingship. The written sources and informants almost unanimously underscore the network of power surrounding the king, the 4 ministers, the 33 inner districts, the 25 outer confederations of Yushu, and 18 monastic divisions, which enveloped the numerous religious institutions of the realm. The uniting factor was the king's religious authority, while his direct political power extended only over the 33 inner districts. So we just have to concur that kingship in Nangchen was most of all a moral institution and an identity marker much more than a centralized form of power. Nangchen Gar, which served as the capital from the early 18th century, was topographically structured after the cosmological construct of the mandala, in which the royal palace, with the royal palace and the chaplain monastery of Tsechu in its center. This positioned the king as the Chakravartin, the ideal Buddhist sovereign and cosmic creator, ruler of the local universe. The mandala model of 4 cardinal points placed around the focal point was mapped further into the royal districts surrounding including the 4 ministerial estates surrounding the capital. Tracing this layout on a map inspired me to look up Stanley Tambaya's classic work on Buddhism and polity in Thailand from 1967, 76. When we compare the study and the local knowledge of Nangchen, it is no coincidence that the officials directly subordinate to the king totaled to 33. According to Tambaya, this is also a symbolic number in Indic cosmology, which in different variations of the model corresponds to the hierarchy in the divine realm of the Trayas Trimsha. This Indic blueprint was reproduced across the Buddhist and Hindu kingdoms, such as those of Java, Thailand, and Burma, elevating the monarch as the holder of the sacred teachings of the Buddha, a cosmic creator, and an intermediary between the realms of the divine and the human. The Indic cosmological model for the organization of society and for the topographic layout of the capital also illustrates the idea of the galactic polity that Tambaya came up with, a galaxy-like constellation of entities that are autonomous but centered around the figure of the king and fixed in their trajectory of the predetermined social order. Although the cosmocratic influence of the Nangchen monarchs was greater than their political control, their exalted status and symbolic capital, and I'm quoting here from the book by Salins and Graeber on kingship, extended beyond their ability to reinforce it, thereby creating a far-reaching cultural subordination among hinterland peoples without the benefit of real political coercion. Now, the Drukpa monastery of Tsechu was adjacent to the royal palace, providing daily ritual service on the king's demand. 4 powerful monasteries of different sectarian denominations, which more or less surrounded the capital, were engaged in the annual long life ceremony for the ruler. They were wealthy, semi-autonomous spheres whose abbots ruled in the high Behu rank over the secular and religious matters. Depending on the source, they were 3 or 4 monasteries of Gelugpa, Barumpa, Karmakajupa, and Yelpakaju. They were Lap Monastery, Chojak, Surmang, and Tana. Their power and wealth resulted from their tributary connection to the king, as they alternated in their performance of the ritual. Yearly, the monastery whose turn it arrived assigned 15 monks and lamas to recite prayers of their respective tradition and or to read the complete Kanjur, the canonical scriptures believed to be the words of the Buddha, in the presence of the king and his court. So the king's patronage of the 5 monasteries of different sectarian denomination rather reminds us of Dege, right? It shows that that Nangchen modeled itself after the adjacent king of Dege, with whom they shared a lot. And the last king also married the Dege, the princess of the Dege house. The Buddhist Kingdom of Nangchen met its end in 1951 when it was incorporated into communist China. The king was first made head of the local government. He later fell in disgrace with Maoist authorities and passed away under house arrest in 1961. The kingdom was absorbed into China as Yushu Tibetan Autonomous Prefecture, while much of the local elite fled into exile. Nangchen lamas who escaped their home monasteries in the 1950s settled around the world, attracting scores of non-Tibetan disciples. Today, Nangchen as realm of meditators is reimagined in the context of global Buddhist networks as a locus of soteriological hopes. As Nangchen lineages are transmitted around the world, simultaneously also local identity is reimagined. This process contributes to the branding of Nangchen as an important source of global Buddhist identity. Especially, a new generation of lamas are contributing to the branding of Nangchen as an important source of a global Buddhist identity. Sokni Rinpoche, the Jalwan Drukpa, Bardo Turku are merely a few examples of lamas who oversee large transnational Buddhist organizations while recollecting the image of Nangchen, the realm of meditators, in a new context, as a transcendental space of universal soteriological efficacy. These larger lamas very much build on the reputation of their lineages and gurus from Nangchen, from old Nangchen, including Turko Ujin Rinpoche, Ado Rinpoche, and Karma Chinli Rinpoche, who managed to escape their home monasteries in the 1950s or later, launching successful careers as meditation masters for transnational audiences. In Old Nangchen, these elite lamas were seen as representatives and guardians of the distinct style of Vajrayana practice, the collective narrative of belonging, and of the local discourse of territoriality. Thus, as the Nangchen lineages are transmitted around the world, simultaneously also local identity is re-envisioned. Turko Ocalan's memoirs, The Blazing Splendor, a bestseller among Buddhist converts in Europe and in North America, illustrates an enthusiastic reception for this co-emergence of Buddhism and local identity. Although lamas like Tsoknyi Rinpoche or the Jawan Rupa were not born in Old Nangchen or in the modern Yushu prefecture, they are examples of lamas who chose to associate with Nangchen in order to emphasize their work as authentic spiritual leaders capable of catering to the global interests in meditation. Among the best illustrations of such reconnections with the specifically local Buddhist lore of Nangchen is the motion picture Blessings, the Tsoknyi Nangchen nuns of Tibet, narrated by Richard Gere and made at the request of Tsoknyi Rinpoche. In this film, the experience of a hermitage revived in modern Yushu represents Nangchen, the realm of meditators, while at the same time it reflects global longings for a Tibet as the locus of soteriological hopes. All right, so I'm coming to an end. And so what are our possibilities in the work of decolonizing? We've revealed the colonial histories, the colonialist epistemologies. We've voiced the emic narrative. Now we want to find the appropriate instruments to understand this narrative. Because the total control of the People's Republic of China prevails, decolonizing Nangchen presents a challenge. One way to move forward is to inquire about the functionality of the concept of indigeneity. This concept is not universally recognized by Tibetans. The native positionality presents various risks in the face of China's settler practices and rigid authoritarianism. For many Tibetans in the diaspora, indigeneity may be viewed as ineffective or weak in their political struggles for recognition as a legitimate government. Therefore, the focus on the local narrative presents an ethical responsibility. While resounding the native voice, we have to protect our informants and indigenous scholars living and working in China. However, as a signpost for a subaltern otherness and underground histories, indigenous positionality can be mobilized to reveal and undo the colonial entanglements that have long obstructed this study of the Tibetan plateau. As a final point of my talk today, I want to argue that studying the native representations of Nangchen's social organization complicates our understanding of subalternity. The subaltern lens has been preset by anthropology and social history to especially focus on groups of lower status, class, or caste. However, in Nangchen, the contemporary identity revival and memory practices around the emic narrative are carried out mostly by former elites. This is to be expected since in Nangchen, the religious and secular elites were the ones who upheld tradition and wrote history in the face of colonial histories and their superimposed epistemologies. Behind the large majority of today's historiographic works are traditionally schooled prominent monks and lamas who are also additionally members of noble clans grouped around the king. I just want to mention 3 out of many such contemporary scholars who are at the same time esteemed tantric masters, are or were. So Ado Rinpoche of the Drukpa Kagyu, born into a noble clan, was chaplain to the last king. His collected works are featured on Buddhist digital resource, in the Buddhist Digital Resource Center. Tsangsar Lodro Rinchen of the Nyingma and Barom Kagyu was born into the Tsangsar, another noble clan whose members co-ruled the kingdom in the 14th century. Tsangsar Monastery also used to archive historical documents, but to my knowledge, they are not accessible anymore. They might have even been destroyed. Karma Tinli Rinpoche of the Satya and Karma Kagyu was born into the Bomba, one of the most powerful families in Nangchen, actually second after the king. Rinpoche authored the mentioned first new chronicle of the kingdom while in India. Rinpoche has also been tremendously important for Canadian world Buddhism. And I'm glad to say that his students celebrated his 90th birthday anniversary just yesterday. So congratulations. I suspect that because such native scholars represented pre-modern elites, this may have contributed to the fact that the native Kampa voices have been largely ignored by some segments of post-structuralist anthropology and social history. And perhaps it may be embarrassing for some to know that most historical Kampa polities were hierarchical and based on private land ownership and overlordship of dependent peasantry and pastoralists. Estate owners in Nangchen did keep land-bound peasants and pastoralists obligated to cultivate the lord's fields, perform corvée and other duties, but the lords also had duties towards their subjects. They were obliged to solve legal conflicts, organize military protection, and what is important to us in Buddhist studies, to sponsor religious ceremonies open to the wider public. Noble clans were also instrumental in the sponsorship of reincarnate lamas and cultural production in and around monasteries. So actually studying clan histories from Eastern Tibet will also contribute to our understanding of the proliferation of Buddhism by pre-modern societies. Ignoring the role of the former elites who have preserved the local narrative will hinder the work of decolonizing. Also, in terms of historical and social fairness to our Kampa informants, it is quite simply undeserved. Across Eastern Tibet, the historical elites were the ones to suffer the most shocking violence and complete dispossession from the hands of the Maoist cadres from 1958 and onwards. For instance, Adar Rinpoche spent 15 years in prison camps where he almost died just because he was a High Lama who had a close connection to the king. So this will provide us, this kind of approach, I hope, will provide us with the opportunity to rethink the subaltern. So in other words, whose voices should we document as scholars and why? And in this work, I'm inspired by the post-war sociology of European elites. There's a great book by Longina Jakubowska called Patrons of History, focusing on Polish nobility from my native land. Okay, very few final lines. I know that we are running out of time, or rather I am running out of time for my presentation. So I would like to demonstrate how the Nangchen elites were invested with the power to exercise stewardship over ancestral and spiritual relations to the native land. They were important in identity and placemaking. Their significance endures today. What I've said is that my fieldwork data shows that it is mostly thanks to the former ruling classes that a collective identity revival takes place today among Nangchen elites in North America and in India. A good example of this are rituals dedicated to the war god / Buddhist protector Bentong, a wrathful deity believed to guard the Bomba, one of the most prominent clans in Nangchen. Exhortation rituals dedicated to Bentong were popular on Bomba estates, and apparently not only clan members themselves, but also not only among clan members themselves, but also among their dependents and servants. These rituals emphasize the Bomba status as main political players within the realm and as lords who ruled over their subjects in accordance with Buddhist ethics and in harmony with indigenous local beliefs. But these rituals were also periodic reminders of, and indeed investments in, the moral power of the kingdom's elite. Through a recurrent restoration of the local socio-political cosmology, the Bomba could reposition themselves as mediators with the deity who universally benefits all beings. The larger goal of such rituals was to demonstrate how the local universe was subordinate to and facilitator of Buddhist enlightenment. And this was not merely a preferred outcome. The rituals illustrated a lived synergy between religious ideology and local values, between high and popular religion, between elite and broader belonging. Bentong invocations are practiced among the Bomba living in the diaspora today. The territorial belonging of the Nangchen people is performed by recreating place identity in ritual. Thus, local gods can be mobilized to heal the collective trauma and unresolved grief of Maoist violence and potentially counteract the challenges of living in contemporary China and in the diaspora. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maria. That was wonderful, such a rich talk, and so great to hear about your research. Now we have not much time left in our schedule, and I'm eager to hear from Sangsarima, so I think we should give her the rest of the time, and we can then continue the conversation as a group over social media, because we can post this recording and we'll be able to have a larger conversation on Twitter or Facebook or elsewhere. So we'll turn now to Dr. Ujid.
Thank you so much, Maria, for that talk. It's very exciting to hear more about your research, and I have so much to say and so many questions, but I'll try to keep it to the ones that I deem the most relevant here. So I think your work is so important for decolonizing the very idea of this perceived greater Tibet and decentering the narratives that we associate with it. I think the emphasis you give to the historiographical works by local scholars, indigenous scholars, is key, because this is something that's not done as much as it could be or should be today. And from my understanding, these historiographical works, which are pretty recent, also integrate oral histories and local narratives that are preserved as part of these traditions. So I think the way that you combine a historical methodology with the study of Nangchen region, as well as looking at it in regard to how it's relevant in terms of contemporary Tibet and also Tibetans in diaspora, is very powerful. Because one of the things that comes across in conversations with Tibetans in diaspora is this break with their histories and access to the study of their own histories and the gradual loss of the Tibetan language. So being able to present this to not only the field of Tibetan studies, but also Tibetan Buddhist studies, and also making available to the younger Tibetans in diaspora is extremely powerful, because I think our histories, well, people's histories contribute to the identity, especially in the case of threat that's coming from all different angles, from different parts of the world today. So again, going back to the oral histories, or the oral local and indigenous historiographies, I think this is really important to note, because similar things are happening in that region, and other scholars, some Tibetan scholars who are out in the West, are also attempting to do so. So I think your work really complements that. So even just in the region of Kham, there was a recent MPhil thesis on the history of the Jew lineage, which I think we spoke about briefly, so I won't go into in too much detail now. That really, it's a Tibetan who's in exile, he's now in the West, and he's trying to understand the lineage of his people based on a text that was written in 1836. So that's during the Qing period. So I think the historiographical works that you are focusing on tell us the narrative today, how the local people, how the Tibetans themselves, how the people from Nangchen are visualizing their past and their present in relation to their identities. But I think it's a continuity. It's a continuation of efforts that have been, well, it's been a continuous effort. There's examples of it in the Qing. And I think your work also does a lot for giving voice to those that are perceived to be on the margins, on the frontiers, people in those peripheral areas. But if we just lay out the map of where Nangchen is throughout the history of the Tibetan Plateau and China and the other empires that ruled those regions, it's not really on the periphery, it's right in the center. So during the Tangut, we know of all the Buddhist influences between the Tangut rulers and the Karmakagi traditions in that region, and then earlier on, well, in that same kind of line, there's the Khitan Empire, and then during the Yuan, this place was really not on the periphery at all. Yet somehow it's kind of escaped the eye of scholarship. Yet, as you mentioned, it's seen as a birthplace of yogis, the birthplace of great scholars. Just next door, which, you know, in the Qinghai region, Kuknor, for some reason, that was a region that attracted all of these Mongolian Hans that left their own homelands to settle there. And that wasn't just Gulshan. This happened multiple times before. And then right next door to that, we have Alaksha, which is now we see it as this peripheral region in Inner Mongolia, just by the mountains, by the desert. Yet that was also seen as a birthplace of great scholars whose works are still used in debate and monastic education in the great monastic centers of the Gaelic tradition. So this place, as you mentioned, is really not it should not be marginalized in the way that we envision it. So I think your research will reveal much about its importance and how different regions, whether it be central or marginal, can come together to tell the story of what you call the larger Tibetan cultural sphere and how it was used for the vehicle for Buddhist transmission. And this really excites me because thinking about the wider Tibetan Buddhist world, the Tibetan cultural world, is a sphere full of networks and entanglements that we need to follow, not detangle, to see it as it is by taking into account not only the written sources that the field has really been relying on to tell these narratives, but also to take into account local histories and more recent historiographies to really put the different pieces of the puzzle together to see it in its larger whole. So thank you so much. So I just have a couple of small questions. So you mentioned something about the comparative analysis of these more recent historical narratives with similar narratives. And I just wanted to know where you're taking that, like what your point of comparison is or might be in the future, because that very excites me. And then another one about just your range of sources, because I think you combine historical sources, more recent historiographies, as well as oral narratives and your own ethnographical research. So I think that's really refreshing. So I'm intrigued, even just personally, about how you do this.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for this comment. I've been wildly writing down everything you were saying. It will be very fruitful for my further work. So thank you very much. Now I will try to respond to your questions. So about the comparative potential of this material, it's pretty big, I would say. So first of all, we can go expand to other Tibetan societies, to Dege, the neighboring place, and other Kampa polities. And I've been reading up on them and to see what's going on. Then I was very surprised to notice some parallels to the wider Buddhist societies, so Thailand and Burma and even Hindu states. So I don't think that's a coincidence, but I don't know what is behind it. And I think this is just a finger pointing at the moon, you know, as we would say, following the Tibetan proverb. So I would like to follow that. And then there's also, obviously, you have to read Nangchen's history along with Tibetan histories and Tibetan chronicles, Tibetan historiography. This is also because Nangchen historians are using all of these conventions that we know from Central Tibet. They're using the same periodization. Yeah, it's the very same thing as we find in the classical chronicles of Central Tibet. What else is there? I mentioned I'm experimenting with the issue of indigeneity. There is a great potential to compare the Nangchen society within China and in the diaspora with the indigenous aboriginal people of North America. There's a lot of exciting potential there, and I'm afraid I won't have time to mention that. So I would just go to your second question about the range of sources. Yes, so I've enumerated. So first of all, everything I'm reading is new. It's from 1965 onwards. There is less books published in the diaspora in comparison to those published within China. But that is also changing. And actually, this material is growing because there is a historical movement in Jekondo today. And there are people who are also, now different people are emerging on the scene. For instance, school teachers who are hobby historians, you can say. They collect all these materials and they organize small symposiums and they trade materials. I'm even in contact with them. We trade our books because a lot of it is, of course, digital as well. So that's one thing, the new chronicles. Then there's virtually nothing archival that I could lay my hands on, except for the different copies and facsimiles that are reproduced in those books, like the supposed Gushi Khan edict from Lamchen Gyalpo's book. I cannot assess the authenticity of that, or, you know, but this is what the local tradition is pointing to. Here we have an edict. Then there is ethnography, which is only just beginning, and certainly the pandemic has not helped me in collecting ethnographies. I was going to go to Jekondo and I was going to work with my friends and collaborators here in Toronto. None of that has happened. And I don't know how this will be continued. So, but yes, I already have some material on that. There's digital ethnography. Luckily, we can simply look at the different internet presences of the different associations and organizations organized around this memory of Nangchen, and see what and how they are reiterating this story, this narrative. There's also webinars one can become invited to. For instance, I'm very grateful to work with Kamak Chiniya Rinpoche and his students, and yesterday I could participate in his 90th birthday celebration. So that's wonderful. especially that we are still not allowed to leave the house in Ontario. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that. Do you think we have time for another? Well, I guess we're coming off to an end now. So I think one last thing quickly to say is, I think you're really giving voice to these voices that would otherwise be not heard. In some of the field works that I've done in kind of Alaksha and Ortus, so that's in Inner Mongolia now, but they also have these local narratives about how they visualize their Buddhist past and how they understand their identity. And oftentimes they're really asking me if I could tell these stories in my work to preserve these texts and work with the texts that they're very happy to share, because I think, you know, inside of the Greater China right now, there is a difficulty in having these narratives shared. So again, I think it's really exciting, and I'd be very happy to share some of the other narratives. It's about 250 miles east to your location, but I guess, you know, it's not too far by those standards. So yeah, I'm very excited to have more conversations with you in the future.
Oh, thank you very much again to everyone who came here, to the host center in York University for organizing, to Sanserma for her wonderful comments. To everyone, thank you very much.
Yeah. And thank you, Maria, for sharing your research with us, and Sanserma Ujid for sharing your expertise and your response.
And thank you for having me. This was delightful. And yes, I've been looking forward to a while. And again, very grateful to be part of it all. And thank you for your time and organization that went on behind the scenes. So.
Okay, have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, Kadunche.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.